in growth and an unfair system of taxation, coupled with deep, rapid cuts, have moved us to the brink of a second recession. It appears that a simple capitalist maxim is being followed by this coalition: raise unemployment, force down the cost of labour and maximise profits. The misery of the majority so that a small minority can keep the rewards. What happened to shared misery, Mr Cameron? What happened to our fair society? Our governments tell us there are no alternatives. We know better. There are alternatives based on fair systems of taxation and investment in growth. The Robin Hood tax is one alternative based upon an idea conceived by James Tobin, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. The Robin Hood tax is a small tax on big financial transactions between banks. It could raise in excess of £20 billion a year. The IMF says it would work, and it has growing support from France, Japan, Spain and Germany. It is already operated successfully in Argentina and Brazil on banking transactions and currency taxes. In September 2010, I was proud to represent NASUWT when the Council of Global Unions met in Geneva and drew up a Quality Public Services Charter that the NASUWT signed up to, supporting equality of access to public services for all. It supports the fundamental view that we must strive to create societies that are equal, prosperous and democratic, that we should adopt policies and strategies that meet the needs of everyone in society to have access to transport, health and education, as well as cultural and political freedoms and the right to enjoy decent conditions of service. All the political leaders of the devolved nations need to take heed and ensure their legislation supports that premise. Mr Cameron, you are clearly in for some very sleepless nights if Claire Rayner's last words hold true. She said she'd come back to haunt you if you screwed up the health service. Well, we're right behind you, Claire. In fact, the NASUWT is more than happy to haunt Mr Cameron to prevent him destroying our state system of education. Another alternative is to crack down on tax avoidance by big companies and the super-rich. HMRC estimates that we lose around £60 billion a year through non-payment of taxes and tax avoidance by big companies and the super-rich. Recruiting extra staff in tax collection could raise this country £20 billion a year. Another tried and tested alternative is investment in growth. Over the last 150 years, we have had sustained economic growth through investment in the public sector. That investment has meant growth in the private sector. There are real economic and social benefits in public spending. Capital spending has been cut in all the devolved nations, with a massive detriment to the education of children from working families. Cutting building schools for the future in England was not only disastrous for our schools, it was devastating to the private sector, with the loss of £8 billion of contracts. Historically, increased government investment in the public sector as a percentage of the gross domestic product has grown persistently until the spread of the neoliberal politics in the 1980s, led by, guess who, the Thatcher, Reagan and Pinochet governments. They reversed that trend with a corresponding detriment to the country's economies, health and education, much like the current abortive attempts at stimulating economic growth. Schools became derelict, school budgets were massively underfunded and state education was denigrated in a press that supported the Conservative government. That position improved under New Labour, and from 2000 onwards, with increased public spending and raised standards in education. Enter the Cameron government with its slash-and-burn approach to public services that make Margaret Thatcher look a little like a social philanthropist. What about the alternative of introducing land taxes? Land taxes are supported by Adam Smith, Thomas Paine and Winston Churchill. Churchill said in support of land tax, roads are made, streets are made, services are improved, electric lights turn night into day, water is brought from reservoirs 100 miles off in the mountains, and all the while the landlord sits still. Every one of those improvements is affected by the labour and the cost of other people and the taxpayers. To not one of those improvements did the land monopolist, as a land monopolist, contribute, and yet every one of them, the value of his land is enhanced. He renders no service to the community, he contributes nothing to the general welfare, he contributes nothing to the process from which his own enrichment is derived. That was Winston Churchill. Hong Kong raises around 38% of its revenue through land tax. Australia uses land tax. Why doesn't the United Kingdom? There are alternatives. Investment in public service, as economic evidence shows, is the key to economic growth. It provides education and health for modern economies worldwide in a far more efficient and effective way than the private sector ever could. Public spending has been used worldwide to generate an economic stimulus to counter recession and to rescue banks through public ownership. The crisis was not caused by government deficits, but it is being managed through public spending. Half of all jobs worldwide are supported by public spending. 2/3 of those jobs are in the private sector through contracts and multipliers. The government needs to invest in public services, especially education, to create a better future. The long-term economic advantages of higher public spending remain unchanged. To move societies forward, you need to invest in public services. Public spending is one of the greatest levers for achieving greater equality. There are alternatives. Internationally, there appears to be an overt attack on education, teachers, trade unions and equality. In my work on the National Committee for the Justice for Colombia, I have become aware that our government is considering entering into a free trade agreement with Colombia. Colombia is the country where human rights offences are commonplace, where nearly 200 trade unions have been killed since 2007, many of them teachers. It is time for the killings to stop, and until they do, we must not enter any free trade agreements with Colombia. It is not only Colombia that attacks trade unions, teachers and state education. In the USA, hundreds of teachers are being made redundant as a result of massive cuts. In Wisconsin and Ohio, the respective states are mounting sustained attacks on teachers' trade unions, on collective bargaining rights and on the teachers' conditions of service. Sound familiar, comrades? We must support our international brothers and sisters in their struggle to establish a fair system of education that supports freedom and equality. The last thing education needs is a return to the 1980s, where public service cuts saw hospital waiting lists increase daily and where children were taught in crumbling schools without textbooks. We need to keep sending this government and the people of this country a clear message that public services are the lifeblood of economic recovery. Privatisation has proved time and again it does not provide better services. It does result in greater profits out of the public purse for private entrepreneurs. The root cause of this economic malaise was the inherent weakness of the private sector, its inability to self-regulate that allowed the hedge fund gamblers and international bankers to plunge us into a worldwide economic recession. What about the future? The new education bill in England receives royal assent in the autumn. Cameron has stated it will finish Thatcher's unfinished business of breaking the state monopoly of education. The Coalition's political ideology, enshrined in their white paper, affirms all public services will be open to private sector bidders. It will mean less accountability, increased profits for private sector at the expense of your pay and conditions, your salaries and our children's education. It will be a legacy of discontent left by this coalition government, where children from ordinary working families will be treated as second class in an education system that only affords benefits to those who can pay to live in the best catchment areas and with the money to pay university tuition fees. Crumbling schools, unqualified teachers in academies and free schools with no public accountability and the destruction of the infrastructure of local authority service provision are not the answer. In England, the Academies and Free Schools Bill was rushed through by the Secretary of State with the Education Bill, which we are told will increase competition and increase autonomy, following fast on its heels. Far from giving teachers greater autonomy,